tāhiki e. Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi ki a koutou. Kua hui mai nei I tēnei rā, I tau toko ana I te ako. Nā mihi nui ki te Murray, ki te kai kauhau o te rā. Tēnā koe. Kei te tai o hanga ahu I mahi ana. He kai whakahare I te puna taio. Ko James Horton toko ingoa. Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Horton and I'm manager of Te Puna Taio, the natural resources team here at the Treasury. I'll be your facilitator today, and it's great to see such a good turnout to hear from our guest today as part of the Treasury Guest Lecture series. Murray, as you know, Carolee is unwell and is very disappointed that she could not be here to thank you for coming to present to us today. Carolee was privileged to speak at the launch of your book last month. You'll be pleased to know that Carolee has read the book end to end and considers it a thorough and insightful contribution to the literature on this topic. It's also timely for Treasury's work program as we tackle a range of projects in this area, include a better measuring natural capital as part of our work towards the Wellbeing Report. So look, it's my pleasure to introduce Murray Petrie to the Treasury Guest Lecture series. Murray has a wide range of experience in government, civil society and academia. He worked here at Te Taiohanga from 1988 to 1997 and is now a Senior Research Associate at the Institute of Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University, a life member of Transparency International, and a member of the IMF's panel of fiscal experts and the OECD's expert group on green budgeting. Murray's going to talk to us today about environmental governance and stewardship, including greening fiscal policy, environmental reporting and more. I did a bit of background research on Murray's book, and the framework in Murray's book has been described as deliberately ambitious given the severity, scale and urgency of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I'm expecting this session will not only be informative, but also challenging for us and the work that we do. We've set aside a good amount of time for questions, so as Murray talks, please add your questions to the chat. If others are particularly keen to have a question answered, if you could please indicate this by putting a thumbs up by the question. Murray will take some time to respond to them after he has finished the presentation. So without further ado, Murray, over to you.
And thank you also to Carolee for her support. As you noted, she spoke at the launch of the book and very appreciative of her positive comments, and I hope she recovers quickly from her illness. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today. As you can see from the title of the presentation, Holding Governments to Account for Environmental Stewardship. So it's essentially a framework around transparency and accountability, which is the domain I've been working in for the last 20 or 30 years, mainly in the fiscal transparency space, fiscal risk, and more recently in the interface between fiscal policy and the environment. I should say at the outset that, in a sense, this work that I'm presenting started in New Zealand. I became increasingly concerned about the state of the environment in New Zealand. And in 2018, I wrote an article that's published in Policy Quarterly, which actually covers a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and that was focused on environmental sustainability in New Zealand. I then, because I essentially do all my work offshore internationally for the IMF, the World Bank, OECD, for NGOs in Washington, etc., I then basically took that framework globally and published a book at the end of last year. And there's a very large overlap between the origin of the work in New Zealand and where I ended up in the book. But I want to say at the outset that I do all my work offshore. And so I by no means present myself as an expert on environmental policies in New Zealand or the interaction between fiscal policies and environmental policies in New Zealand. So that I'll be presenting essentially the global framework that I've developed. And I'll be noting at various points interactions or the situation here in New Zealand, particularly recent developments around environmental reporting and target setting and indeed well-being budgeting. So to head into the presentation, just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to start talking about environmental governance and compare it to the governance we have for other core functions of government, particularly fiscal policy and monetary policy, and discuss relative levels of transparency and accountability for environmental governance. I'll then talk about environmental reporting, by which I mean national state of the environment reporting, which has become much more in focus in New Zealand in recent years. Then I'll talk about mainstreaming environmental stewardship in government strategy and the budget process. I see very much the fiscal policy and the annual budget cycle as the core mechanism by which environmental policies, environmental sustainability can be mainstreamed across government. I'll talk about the evolution of green budgeting globally, particularly since around 2010, and I'll have a short section on that to sort of place in context where we are in New Zealand and what's been going on internationally. Then I'll present my proposed framework for the greening of fiscal policy. It's a comprehensive framework. As James said, it's deliberately ambitious, and I'm sure it will attract some discussion. Then I'll talk just briefly about the role of civil society monitoring, the importance of that, and I'll finish with some concluding observations and some key takeaways. So if we start talking about environmental governance and levels of transparency and accountability, first of all, what motivates this work is that current approaches to environmental stewardship are demonstrably failing. We have the global climate change crisis, and we also have a biodiversity crisis, each of which has been regarded as a threat to the future of life on the planet, essentially. So these are serious threats, and I'm focused not just on climate change, as some of the literature in this space is, but also on the biodiversity and broader environmental degradation. And I sort of, just at the start of the book, I go back to the 1987 Brundtland Commission, the famous commission on sustainable development that gave us the definition of sustainable development that is widely used. And in 1987, that commission called for the major central economic agencies of governments to be made directly responsible for ensuring that their policies and budgets support ecologically sustainable development. And I guess I argue that there has not been much progress in that regard since 1987, that's 35 years ago. But starting 10 years or so ago, there has been increasing focus on this space, prompted largely by climate change initially, and in the last few years in particular, as I'll describe, there's a lot of developments in the interface between environmental sustainability and fiscal policies. So just a basic sort of primer in a sense, what's the framework I'm using for comparing accountability and transparency across domains? Well, I just put down here some core elements of governance and management in either the public or the private sectors. It starts with reliable measurement of the outcomes that matter to establish a baseline. Then there's the forward-looking elements of outlooks and forecasts under current policies and drivers of policies. The setting of goals and measurable targets for outputs and outcomes. Regular independent reporting on progress to oversight entities. Analysis of the effectiveness of strategies and policies, etc., in achieving progress towards the goals, and changes to policies and practices as necessary, and holding managers to account. So it's a simple, I think, recognised framework. What are the core elements of governance and management? And then in this table, I'll spend just a little time on this table. It's a little complicated, but I'm comparing policy governance in the environmental sphere compared to particularly fiscal policy, but also monetary policy. And on the left-hand side in column 1, we have forward-looking, the ex-ante elements of outcome targets, targets required, milestones required, and then the ex-post elements of independent monitoring reports. I've got alignment with the electoral cycle, which is, I think, a novel idea in my framework, independent commentary and mandate and government response. I'll just quickly go down the fiscal policy column. I mean, we're all pretty familiar with this in New Zealand and the international context. outcome targets set by the legislature. I've got yes with square brackets. So that includes a requirement to set outcome targets without the targets being in the law, but it also includes the quantitative fiscal rules that are in place, for example, in the European Union. So in fiscal policy, good practices is recognise the need for targets for policy, for milestones against those targets, and for regular independent reporting on progress, independent commentary, and then government has to internalise that and in the next budget cycle. So we've got a lot of yeses in that third column under fiscal policy. And then I'll just talk about the fifth column, which is sort of common environmental governance practices. And you'll see that nearly all of those are no. Typically no outcome targets set by the legislature or milestones. There is a practice of national state of the environment reports. Some of those are under conditions of technical independence. By no means all of them are, again, noted there. And there's a lack of independent commentary, and in many cases, there's no government response. In fact, that's the typical situation with state of environment reports. They're published in government and they gather dust on a shelf. I then, in the final column, put Swedish environmental governance. They've long been recognised as a leader in this space for the last 20 years or so. Their legislature has set, I think it's 16 environmental outcome targets, and there's regular progress reporting against those targets with independent monitoring, etc. I note at the bottom of that slide that after I published this slide, the UK passed its Environment Act in December at the end of last year, and the UK now requires all governments to set mandatory targets for 5 or 6 core environmental domains: air quality, water quality, biodiversity, etc. So that's a very interesting initiative, and I also refer there to the natural and built environment exposure draft, which was presented to the New Zealand Parliament last year, which also would mandate the setting of targets and limits for a small number of specified environmental outcomes. So there is movement in this space, but in general, and this is a global comparator, there's a significant lack, as I say here, of legislative requirements for transparency of goals and targets. And clearly this is leaving climate change mitigation aside. Paris Climate Change Agreement 2015 and its precursors have motivated a move towards outcome-focused targets for climate change mitigation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and levels and progress reporting. So leaving aside climate change mitigation, which has over the last decade or so become an important area of transparency and governance, compared to the other policy domains, fiscal policy, monetary policy, there's a lack of transparency for goals and targets, regular reporting. As I note on that slide, there's quite a well-known quote, I think: "A goal without a plan is just a wish." And the number of governments, even that went to the Glasgow meeting last November on climate change with new, empty, probably vacuous promises that were, some of which were just recycled old promises. The number of times we've had vague promises in New Zealand to tidy up the waterways by 2040 or whatever it might be. What we need is a clear framework of more specific interim targets, milestones, reporting, and verification. But this is typical, leaving aside climate change mitigation. As I say, this is the typical state of environmental governance, I assert, around the world. We then move on to environmental reporting, which, as I said, I'm referring to national state of environment reporting. There's a recognised international framework for this, referred to as the DIPSA framework. You can see it there on the right. Apologies, some of the type is perhaps a bit small. It's essentially a framework of drivers. What are the drivers of environmental change that create pressures on the environment? They're reflected in states, environmental state outcomes, as it were. They have impacts on society, and those impacts and the drivers, etc., elicit social responses both by government and non-government actors. So this is the reasonably well-recognised international framework. It's standard practice in the EU and the neighbouring countries in the EU and the EEA. It's used also I mean, in New Zealand, Australia, Turkey, Canada, and a number of other OECD countries. But it is essentially a backward-looking framework. You can see there's no forward-looking elements. Some state of environment reports include forward-looking scenarios and outlooks, but in general, this framework lacks the forward-looking element particularly of risk, environmental risk. And the forward-looking risk, as we know, has become a core part of management. If we think about fiscal transparency standards, the first 1998 Code of Good Practices on fiscal transparency had almost nothing on fiscal risk. 2 of the 40 or so provisions in that code were about fiscal risk. When that was rewritten after the global financial crisis, the 2014 IMF Fiscal Transparency Code has fully 1/3 of the 36 elements. 12 of the 36 are on fiscal risk. We see it also in the private sector. The climate-related financial disclosures framework is very heavy on forward-looking risk analysis. So this forward-looking component is essentially missing from the DIPS framework. Governments are not required to respond, and they typically don't respond. And if you look at the literature, many state of environment reports gather dust. And one of the few indicators of whether it had an impact that I've seen is, was it even mentioned in a public speech by a minister, which is a very low level measure of impact. So these are typically produced by environment agencies and do not get much attention. I say they're not universally published. They're really only published by advanced countries, some middle income, some developing countries with donor support, but it's by no means a widely used instrument globally. And of course, inevitably, as we've seen in New Zealand and in any advanced country, but particularly in developing countries, these reports exhibit gaps in the availability of data and in the capacity to analyse and present results. So I conclude that the State of Environment Report, the National State of Environment Report, is very far from being recognised as core to sustainable development. I liken it a bit to having a Public Finance Act, which doesn't refer to how you're going to measure the accounting standards by which you're going to measure performance, how you're going to report performance, how you're going to verify it, etc. So to me, this is a big gap in accountability for environmental stewardship globally. So in the book, or generally, I make a number of proposals to strengthen national state of environment reporting. This should include, as I say, forward-looking information on distance to targets, outlooks and scenarios, and as feasible, actual forecasts of the critically important environmental outcomes, trying to identify as feasible potential tipping points, etc. Governments should be required to respond to each state of environment report, stating their priorities and what they're going to do. Reports should be aligned as feasible with the midpoint in the electoral cycle to try and, again, strengthen the level of democratic debate and accountability, keep it away from the immediacy of an election campaign. And there's obviously a need for public investment in the environmental reporting framework, which requires more data collection, more monitoring capacity, reporting systems, and technical capacity across government. And obviously that's a huge ask, and it's not an immediate task. It's a long-term game. Now, bringing this to the New Zealand situation, the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment wrote a report in 2019 in which he actually recommended a number of these elements. The forward-looking component, the New Zealand framework lacked even the drivers component of the driver's pressure state impact response framework. He also recommended that governments should be required to respond. And earlier this year, just in February, the Ministry for the Environment published a consultation document on proposed changes to New Zealand's Environmental Reporting Act that pick up pretty much, I think, all of the Parliamentary Commission's recommendations and some additional ones. So there's a lot of good progress. We didn't even have an act until 2015. We didn't have any practice of regular environmental reporting. We had two one-off reports in 1997 and 2007. We're now into a regular cycle of reports. We've had some initial experience, and it looks like the framework will be very usefully strengthened. But I do have some views that the Ministry for the Environment consultation document doesn't quite go far enough. So the third element in my proposed framework after the environmental reporting is that we need to mainstream environmental stewardship in government strategy and the budget process. And countries should develop a dashboard of critically important physical and environmental indicators rather than attempting to assign monetary values to them and producing an augmented measure of GDP. So this is just the Stiglitz-Sen-Fatoussi Commission, I think widely accepted recommendation from 2009. Don't try and monetize everything. Focus in the environmental sphere very much on the physical environmental outcome indicators. And they called particularly for indicators of proximity to dangerous levels of environmental damage. So I advocate that government should set and report against time-bound environmental targets for just a small set of critically important environmental outcomes. I'm not talking about a shopping list of 50 or 100 indicators. I'm talking about potentially 5 or 6, so as they have in the UK Environment Act, a small number that are referred to in the exposure draft of our Natural and Built Environment Act in New Zealand. And this is sort of, in a sense, analogous to the approach in the Public Finance Act, the Reserve Bank Act, and most recently the Child Poverty Act, where the government is required to state targets and then to report on them without the targets themselves being set in legislation. So I then argue that environmental stewardship needs to be integrated in fiscal strategy. Now, why do I regard the government's fiscal policy cycle and its annual budget process as the key instrument? Well, I think essentially, well, actually, that I'm anticipating the next slide, so I'll get onto that on the next slide. But I'm arguing here that environmental indicators and trends and resilience and risks and policy implications need to be integrated into government strategy, and particularly fiscal strategy. Current government environmental strategies, targets, and recent performance should be discussed in the context of medium-term fiscal strategy and the plethora of information on economic and fiscal outlooks and economic and fiscal risks. We need some discussion of the consistency of government's environmental targets and announced targets in other policy domains, and a discussion of short to medium-term risks around environmental outcomes. There's increasing scope for win-win policies that are good both for the economy and for the environment. But we also need, inevitably, there will be trade-offs, and we need more clear identification of trade-offs between environmental and other goals, and subjecting those trade-offs to more public deliberation and debate. So as I say, why do I advocate using the budget process as the key instrument? Well, environmental regulation, yes, it's extremely important, but there's no equivalent regulatory policy cycle, an annual cycle, comprehensively across the regulatory domain of government activity that could be used in the same way to mainstream, coordinate, prioritize policy the way that the annual fiscal policy and budget process is able to do. The budget is essentially the government's key policy coordination instrument, and there are increasingly important interactions between fiscal policy and the environment, both positive interactions and negative, and I'll go into more detail on that. There are increasingly important interactions between fiscal policy and regulation in achieving environmental goals. So we have hybrid fiscal regulatory instruments like the emissions trading scheme or fee-baits. The revenue potential of cap and trade schemes is significant, so they're akin to another revenue-raising mechanism. Increasingly recognised, we need smart packages of fiscal and regulatory interventions. Setting a carbon price alone will not be sufficient. There's a need to design packages, complementary packages of fiscal and regulatory interventions to decarbonise the economy and to promote more sustainable development in general. There are also, the adequacy of funding of environmental regulation, data collection, monitoring and evaluation, research and development, etc., are very important for environmental sustainability. And there is, reflecting these points, there is a growing international interest and practice of green budgeting, which I'll describe. So this slide just summarizes at a high level, the two-way interactions between fiscal policies and the natural environment. I just set out on the left-hand side, the full range of fiscal policies and instruments. There's a tendency to focus only on the expenditure side of the budget, but it's extremely important to consider also the role of taxes, royalties, fees, economic instruments, as well as expenditure, both capital and recurrent, government lending and investment, off-budget and off-balance sheet activities, financing, and as I mentioned, cap and trade instruments. So in a sense, encapsulating the full domain of fiscal policies and fiscal regulatory policies, hybrids. And on the right-hand side, the natural environment there, I've used the EU taxonomy of sustainable environmental outcomes for those descriptions of the key elements of the natural environment. This is a taxonomy that the EU developed, published 2020, I believe, is becoming mandatory for use in the private and the public sector throughout the EU, and is supported by a large set of guidance on how to implement. And I think important here is the two-way interaction. Fiscal policies both impact on the natural environment, and in turn, the natural environment is creating an increasing degree of fiscal risk for the public finances, and this has been increasingly recognised. This two-way framework is somewhat distinct from the framework for the private sector that's been developed for the financial sector, the climate-related financial disclosures, which is focused very much on the impact on the entity of environmental degradation, environmental change, climate change, etc. Not the impact of corporations on the environment. It's at this stage anyway, it's that one-way interaction. But I think it's critically important from the public finance point of view, accountability, that both channels of interaction, both directions of interaction are incorporated in a green fiscal policy framework. So as I mentioned, there has been a growing interest in green, what's called green budgeting, which is essentially incorporating environmental considerations into fiscal policy and budgeting, led really by climate change, and interest in so-called climate budgeting by developing countries, which particularly in the Asia Pacific region, with technical support and encouragement by the UNDP and the World Bank. And a number of countries have started from around 2010 and more recently, they are tagging the spending in their budgets that is favourable for climate change. So it could obviously be renewable energy, or reducing deforestation, or planting trees, or increasing water resilience, whatever it might be. They're tagging those expenditures and using those to attract international climate finance. Initially, that was public climate finance from development agencies or multilateral development banks that is supporting your Bangladesh's or your Pakistan, your Philippines, or Kenya, or a number of other countries in developing expenditure programs to tackle climate change, mainly mitigation, but also adaptation to climate change. And more recently, a number of countries, not just advanced countries, but developing countries and middle-income countries have been issuing sovereign green bonds through the same sort of mechanism, by tagging expenditures in their budgets that the sovereign green bond finance will be used to finance. There are now at least 40 countries that are doing that, issuing sovereign green bonds. In our region, Fiji issued a sovereign green bond a number of years ago. New Zealand, as I understand it, will issue its first sovereign green bond this year. So this is a growing space. In 2017, I think probably essentially following on from the political initiative of the Paris Climate Change Summit and the agreement in 2015, the OECD launched the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting. I'll explain that, describe that in just a little more detail in a subsequent slide, but I think this is a very important development, particularly for an advanced country like New Zealand, which participates closely in the OECD and has been involved at least somewhat in these developments. Similarly, in 2019, a coalition of finance ministers for climate change was formed, which has now grown to 70 countries, again, including New Zealand. The assertion is behind the formation of this coalition is that finance ministries are uniquely well positioned in government to understand the challenges of climate change and to advise on some of the key instruments for combating climate change, in particular, setting a climate price throughout the economy, which is a key instrument, but also more generally, issues around green budgeting. So this, again, is an important initiative internationally, and again, New Zealand is involved. So just to quickly run through the OECD's framework for green budgeting, I think a key element of it is that it's designed to help drive improvements in the alignment of national expenditure and revenue processes. So it's both sides of the budget, which is critically important, with climate and other environmental goals. So it's not just climate change, it's all elements of environmental sustainability. And again, I think that's very important. There are 4 key mutually reinforcing building blocks: a strong strategic framework, building on national climate strategy and other environmental strategies that set out priorities and goals, tools for evidence generation like environmental impact assessments, ecosystem services pricing, green spending reviews, etc., reporting a number of new green budget documents, statements, and reports, and an enabling budgetary governance framework, which in some sense will be familiar. So those are the core elements of the OECD framework. This is a diagram. Apologies for the small print. I'm having to squint a little myself here, but I developed this to try and, as I say, there's a bit of a confusion of terminology at the moment. Some people are saying green budgeting when all they're talking about is climate budgeting. Some people are talking about green budgeting when all they're talking about is the expenditure side. Other people are talking in a more comprehensive framework. So climate budgeting is the most narrow, just looking at climate budget tagging. Green budgeting is next, but focused only on the expenditure side, and typically only on those expenditures that are environmentally favourable. And then green budgeting with revenues incorporated, and then at the top I put green fiscal policy and green budgeting, which includes the tax side, the hybrid tax regulatory instruments, and sort of a green medium-term fiscal strategy as well. So just to try and put a little bit of consistency around, or at least how I'm using the terms. Now, just quickly, the couple of tables here giving you some selected examples of what countries are doing across the fiscal policy cycle. Here I've got national planning, budget preparation, budget presentation. Next slide is budget implementation, monitoring, evaluation, audit, fiscal reporting, and public participation. So across the policy cycle, if you like, and I've selected country examples, tried to select advanced, middle income, developing countries, and from a wide range of regions. And I won't go through this, obviously. I'm happy to answer questions on this. Perhaps just highlight a couple of things. I refer to New Zealand under national planning, fiscal strategy linked to environmental and climate change SDGs. Well, that's the wellbeing budgeting framework. I also mention New Zealand in the next slide under monitoring, evaluation, and audit. The independent assessment of environmental effects. Well, that's the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment, which is an unusual institution internationally. I'm not sure that there is another such beast, and I think we're very fortunate to have this independent officer of Parliament, and I'm particularly impressed with the series of recent reports the office has done on environmental reporting, environmental research and development, public spending on it, and wellbeing budgeting. Another perhaps reference in this slide, France, I refer to as comprehensive green expenditure tagging, and tagging of environmental harmful expenditures, not just the positive but also the negative. And I think France is at a leading edge, and I've got a slide shortly on France. Earmarked carbon tax for green spending. Costa Rica, I could have had New Zealand there after the next budget. And I think this practice of earmarking revenues has a lot to go for it in the environmental space, partly for political economy reasons, but also for technical reasons. So, as I say, I won't go through that slide in detail, but just to note that there are a number of leading countries. Actually, one other reference I'll make to Ireland, national development plan with environmental goals and targets. Ireland has a national planning system, and they've also issued sovereign green bonds. I don't refer to them in the reporting under sovereign green bonds. Oh yes, I do actually. And their report is, I think, an impressive one. The sovereign green bond reporting framework requires first a report on allocations, in other words, how the proceeds of the bond have been spent, and then subsequently a report on the impacts of that spending. So again, partly, I think, prompted by the climate change space and the focus on outcomes, greenhouse gas emissions, the reporting basically required by countries that issue green bonds goes beyond just the spending, but also the impacts and Ireland's impact reporting, both with respect to climate change and with respect to other environmental activities and goals, I think is impressive. And if you compare that with performance-oriented budgeting generally in government, across government, in the environment sector, I think it's far superior. So I think we're starting to see some welcome developments in terms of outcomes-focused management in the environmental sphere, partly driven by climate change framework, the Paris Agreement, and partly by the sovereign green bond framework. So I mentioned France. France used the EU taxonomy of sustainable environmental outcomes that I presented in the earlier slide. They basically covered the whole of their expenditure budget. They've got some complexities in their budget with special accounts, etc. Earmarked taxes. They tagged the whole of their budget and tax expenditures. So it's the most comprehensive exercise, I think, to date. And each of the elements, probably essentially the program level, was rated on a scale of -1 for unfavourable through to +3 for very favourable with respect to each of 6 environmental objectives. And they ended up ranking green expenses, mixed expenses, and unfavourable or brown expenses, whatever you might want to call it. And there's the result there. They found about 9% of their total spending had an impact on the environment. 38 billion was favourable, by which it's meant it has a favourable impact on the environment with no significant unfavourable impact to offset it. An amount there for mixed spending, which has both favourable and unfavourable impacts, and some unambiguously unfavourable spending. So this is just the first stage, in a sense. This is just tagging, and then obviously to think about what the actual impacts are and reporting around that. But I think this is a track that is an attractive track to think about going down. Now this is a complex slide. I tried to get my whole framework in one slide, and on a small slide like this, it's not so easy to see. But at the top, we have the environmental stewardship accountability framework. So commitments to national state of environment reporting, setting medium-term fiscal targets, environmental targets. I'm in trouble just reading that myself in that slide, but subjecting all these documents to parliamentary scrutiny and independent audit. So the top part is essentially the legislative framework with commitments to setting environmental targets, commitments to environmental reporting, regular reporting and auditing. The left-hand box is what I said about national state of the environment reporting. The middle box, medium-term government strategy and fiscal strategy. So that's incorporating environmental considerations, outcome indicators, etc., in medium-term strategy, and presenting a suite of green budgeting documents. Now, I won't go through those documents. In a subsequent slide, I talk about entry points for green budgeting, which talks about that in a little more detail. And then on the right-hand box is periodic supplementary green fiscal reports, a green tax review, a green spending review, a green monitoring and evaluation report, and a green fiscal sustainability report. So these are potential components of a comprehensive framework. As was said before, it's ambitious. It's not to be attempted in one go. It's to be strategized over in terms of how you would think about moving down this track. And obviously, starting points matter a lot. So I set out some principles of green fiscal policy to sort of guide this suggested way of guiding this evolution of environmental and fiscal policies, which incorporate all environmental domains, be tailored to individual national priorities. The sustainable development indicators are important, but they're too high level. There are too many of them. Too many of them are not relevant in any particular country. So by all means, report against the SDGs, but don't use the SDGs to try and manage your environmental priority setting or your fiscal policy priority setting. Tailor these to individual circumstances and priorities. Green fiscal policy should be fully integrated in fiscal policy and budgeting. This is not some kind of parallel budget process where you go through the normal budget process and then you do a little parallel supplementary report on how much has been spent on the environment. That is not at all what I'm advocating. It's not what the OECD is advocating. It's not what the finance ministers for climate change are advocating. It's all very much about mainstreaming environmental considerations in the whole fiscal policy and annual budget cycle. I suggest a sort of a conceptual baseline in which taxation spending do not significantly harm the environment as a benchmark against which to assess taxing and spending policies. It's essentially the approach in the EU taxonomy, trying to identify policies that don't actually harm the environment, but positively support environmental sustainability. Social equity is an important consideration here, both because of the negative impacts on the poor and vulnerable, marginalised of environmental degradation, and some of the policies to try and offset environmental degradation, carbon taxation or pricing or whatever it might be, are likely to adversely affect lower-income households, etc. So there's some very important issues around equity and avoiding greenwashing, and I'll have a little more to say about that subsequently. So what are some of the possible objections? Some people have said to me, Murray, you're just trying to prioritise the environment over other goals. It's just a sectoral approach to policy. You're trying to elevate one sector over others, or environmental goals over economic goals over social goals. Well, I think very much on the contrary. The aim here is to ensure that environmental considerations are fully and transparently included in the criteria used in fiscal policy and budget decision making in ways that simply haven't been the case. And I'm talking globally here, and I think still the case in New Zealand. Without systematic information on the environmental outcomes, resilience and risk, and the environmental impacts of fiscal policies, it's almost inevitable that fiscal strategy and annual budgets will be dominated by economic statistics, economic outlooks, economic risks, fiscal statistics, fiscal outlooks, fiscal risks. If that's the basic volume of information that is presented to decision makers during the budget cycle, then environmental sustainability just isn't getting a look in. And as I said before, I think there are a lot of opportunities for win-win policies, and they're being neglected. And we need more transparency around the trade-offs. As the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, I think, put it very nicely in his report at the end of last year on wellbeing budgeting, it may well be the case that any particular annual budget is associated with pressures that will increase environmental degradation. Governments can't do everything, and voters will have their priorities, which will have different weights on environment versus economic and social outcomes. But those trade-offs need to be more transparent, both during the budget preparation and decision-making phase, during the parliamentary oversight phase, during the public reviews phase, during electoral campaigns, etc. And in that way, we'll have a more rich discussion, debate, deliberation around the appropriate balances, because essentially environmental degradation has been mounting at alarming levels globally and in New Zealand. And I think this is the way potentially to redress that through the democratic process, through building environmental considerations more centrally into what I see as a core government process, fiscal policy. A second objection is fiscal policy is not central to climate change mitigation. Most of the investment required is in the private sector. So some people have said to me, look, it's not about public investment, it's about private investment. Yeah, well, that's probably true. But the price of carbon across the economy is a critical variable in terms of kickstarting or furthering the economic transformation required, and only government action, either through taxing or hybrid tax, emission trading scheme type instruments, can provide that price signal along with regulation. So government is critical to this. Private sector, left to its own devices, will pursue profit opportunities driven by prices, and if prices fail to incorporate large-scale environmental externalities, then the private sector will not get us closer to sustainability. Government action is critical. And I think, as I mentioned before, earmarked taxes with compensation and other public good spending could really help to secure majority support for environmental initiatives. So again, government action is key. I mentioned also the need for smart combinations of fiscal and regulatory instruments, and I think this is probably the frontier. I think the UK is the economy that has been most successful in decarbonising so far, largely through getting rid of coal and decarbonising its electricity sector. It used a combination of public spending to develop new market technologies and supply side measures for offshore wind, for example, in combination with regulations. And I think these are the kind of smart packages that will increasingly be required. I mentioned the budget tagging, I think is critically important, both because there's a large supply of international climate finance. The developed countries will be are being obliged and are committing themselves to providing large volumes of climate finance. Developing countries do not cause the historical increase in emissions, but they're the ones emitting most at the margin now. So this international finance transfer is core to the whole thing, and I think issuing green bonds and green budget tagging for official and private international finance is a key mechanism. So what are some of the entry points? There was that diagram which had this ambitious framework, but I've spent quite a bit of time trying to think about practical entry points. Where should government start? What are the most important starting places? Well, it depends obviously very much on individual country circumstances, including the levels and types of exposure to climate change and environmental degradation, and exposure to the associated economic, fiscal, and social impacts. Rebalancing these policies will require inevitably large amounts of public investment, I think in environmental monitoring, reporting, policy analysis, evaluation, etc. We're starting to see that recognition in New Zealand, that our environmental reporting, for example, needs to be supported by increased investment. We need more policy analysis capacity, etc. And this is true, obviously, for an advanced country like New Zealand. It's even more the case in developing and middle-income countries. And there are some, very difficult technical elements that I don't want to gloss over, that I don't pretend to be expert in. But capacity for environmental modelling, forecasting, policy analysis, for attributing impacts to particular government interventions, and the scope of those impacts, scope 1, 2, 3, etc. from the climate change reporting framework. These are all difficult technical issues, but are unavoidable, and progress, I believe, is being made. So I've put in this slide some, I think, key entry points for advanced countries like New Zealand. Again, I start with environmental reporting, and I think, as I say, this is recognised in New Zealand, the need to strengthen our framework and invest more in environmental reporting. Green medium-term fiscal strategy. I suppose the wellbeing budget, the wellbeing objectives in the Public Finance Act is a start, but I think it's only a start, and there's really a need to operationalise wellbeing budgeting in New Zealand through a number of these other elements that I mentioned. Some advanced countries have started to incorporate environmental sustainability in their macro fiscal models. So Denmark, I believe, is at the cutting edge here. They have a macro model which incorporates both the impacts of fiscal policy on environmental outcomes and the impacts of environmental developments, risks, threats on the economy. So I think this is sort of the frontier type stuff, but then also incorporating in key environmental objectives and targets into a discussion of medium-term fiscal strategy. There's the green budget tagging, both positive and negative. As I say, I believe France is the only country so far to tag the negative, which to me is essentially greenwashing. If all you do is package up your the spending that you assert is environmentally positive and forget A, about the whole tax side, and B, about other things you're doing in expenditure, then I think this opens governments to the charge of greenwashing. I think the new budget policies in each budget cycle are an obvious entry point. As we know from budgeting, focus tends to be at the margin, focus of attention of line ministries, ministries of finance, public parliaments, etc. So putting in place systems to assess the environmental impacts of new policies being considered, and that throws up issues around the design of the budget circular, the information that line ministries and departments are required to present with their budget proposals, their capacity to do so, and the Treasury's capacity to analyse these. And I would say also that that ministries for the environment around the world should also be involved in assessing the environmental impacts of new policies. In a sense, I argue that they should be assigned a central agency function with respect to assessing significant environmental impacts of all new policies. Public investment is an important entry point. These long-lived public infrastructure projects that essentially can lock in damaging technologies and approaches for the long term. And so environmentally sensitive planning, coordination across, with public enterprises and subnational government, appraisal, selection for the budget, and risk management across a cycle with respect to public investment, I think is an important entry point. Reviewing the most environmentally damaging taxes and subsidies. Governments around the world continue to spend huge amounts on subsidies for fossil fuels, and these are an obvious technical entry point, if an obviously difficult political entry point. Green fiscal risk analysis, by which I mean the impacts on public finances of environmental degradation, disasters, etc., risk of stranded assets, that kind of thing, I think is an important entry point. Green taxes, I think we've underdone this in New Zealand, and generally globally. I think there's great scope for taxes that can essentially improve environmental outcomes, raise revenue in a non-distortionary way, which is obviously extremely rare for taxes. I think there's a lot of scope for win-win policies here. Public corporations can be huge and do a lot of environmental damage. Performance-oriented green spending, as I mentioned before, and periodic green expenditure reviews. I realise there's a lot of content here, but we can have a discussion, and I don't want to take up too much time. So, and those elements would be associated with a presentation with the budget of a suite of documents and periodic long-term, longer-term reports. And don't want to get specific or define particular things here. Again, it depends on a country's budget system, its current documentation, and whether it's integrated or a separate set of reports. Quickly, I mentioned greenwashing. I think there's a lot of it now, and I think there's a prospect of much more greenwashing from the private sector side. The investors just want to be able to tick that their portfolio is financed green activities. They don't care what else that government is doing. And I think we need more transparency around the overall impact of the budget. And I suggest that a new tool, and this is I'm talking globally, in each country, civil society organizations, environmental NGOs, budget transparency organizations, fiscal experts, produce a green guide to the budget. So this is produced by civil society that looks at a number of these elements that I've been talking about and tries to put pressure on governments to stop greenwashing and to do more proactively for the environment. So some concluding observations and key takeaways. What are some opportunities and pressures for the kind of approach that I'm advocating? Well, I mentioned the win-win solutions reductions in the green premium generally across technologies, international climate finance, the important role of public research and development in developing new technologies to help catalyse private investment, co-benefits of environmental policies. You reduce greenhouse gas emissions and you reduce deaths from air pollution, etc. in many countries. The increasing cost and risk of inaction, we're seeing that through climate change related disasters, etc. Possible carbon border tax adjustment. There may be some sticks involved as well. A small rich country like New Zealand may find increasing pressure if it fails to adjust the carbon intensity of its agriculture sector, for example. Increased awareness of costs and risks from environmental degradation and the inequities of climate change, mounting alarm, and I think opportunities to frame environmental initiatives in ways that can help build majority coalitions. There are some precedents, I think, for this kind of comprehensive approach to transparency and accountability. Obviously, 30 years ago, very few people would have imagined that, many countries around the world have obliged themselves to high levels of fiscal transparency or to binding monetary policy targets. It's only 35 years ago. This was probably regarded as a crazy idea. As I mentioned before, transparent forward-looking risk analysis has become standard to fiscal and monetary policy, and also now with the climate-related disclosures to the private financial sector, and the greenhouse gas emission focus of climate change is helping with this trend. And then finally, I think, so key takeaways: fiscal policy and budgets are the key instruments to mainstream environmental goals and targets. Work at the interface between fiscal management and the environment is at a pretty early stage. Apart from the long-standing requirement for environmental impact assessment at the project level, this space is pretty new. The last 10 years is really what has we've seen the trend really emerge. In the last few years in particular, it's really starting to take off. There are many entry points, in a sense, as I say, many entry points for operationalising New Zealand's wellbeing budgeting framework. Require a long period of phased implementation and investment, and greenwashing is a threat. And I think ideally we'd have rapid development of international standards for governments in this space and new civil society monitoring tools. So thank you. I'm going to stop there and allow half an hour for discussion, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. I see James is
yes. Thanks very much, Murray. As expected, your presentation has provoked a range of questions, actually. I've attempted to group some of them because there's some similar themes coming out. There are a number of questions focusing on holistic measures of well-being. Lifting living standards means looking at intergenerational well-being across a range of capitals, and some of the questions relate to this. So Kate Averill asks, why does Aotea New Zealand not have a country plan, integrating environmental, social and financial approaches and outcomes? 80% of the world's population live in countries with a country plan. There is a need for Aotearoa to have an independent, integrated national planning, measuring and reporting with iwi, private sector and community. This will support collaboration. Any views on that, Murray?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Yes, many countries have national development plans. They still do, although there's been an increasing trend away from them. And this is partly because these plans are often fixed 5-year plans, maybe 4-year plans. A new administration comes in, puts the plan in place. And essentially the plans have to be implemented, a lot of it through the annual budget, because the focus of a lot of those plans is public investment. That's sort of the national planning framework from the 60s, 70s, 80s that New Zealand moved away from some time ago, and most advanced countries have moved away from. With a separate planning ministry and a separate ministry of finance that don't necessarily talk to each other, and you have all these problems of integration of the plan into the budget, because a project in the plan goes nowhere if it's not budgeted. So I referred to Ireland because I think they're interesting. They're an advanced economy about the size of New Zealand that still has a national planning framework, and they have integrated environmental, social cultural economic goals in that framework, and then they implement it in a familiar way in terms of the public financial management system that we have here. I'm not really familiar with Ireland. It might be worth having a look at. But I appreciate your question, because when I look at the Public Finance Act, I see wellbeing has been added to it. And it starts to look to me a bit more like a government strategy act. And where I would like to take the Public Finance Act is more in the direction of a government strategy act. We don't have such an instrument. I don't even know if any government has. That's really probably the National Development Plan. But I think there is an issue that we should, as I have argued, I think we should incorporate more environmental objectives into the Public Finance Act. I can talk about that if anyone's interested. And then I think there really is an issue around machinery of government, because it's no longer fiscal and economic. And maybe that becomes more of an instrument for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. This is really a head of government type statute. And as I said before, you might want to have the Ministry for the Environment and MSD for the social sphere sort of acting as central agency functions with respect to that kind of overall strategy. I think there's just for me, and I haven't seen much written on this, when does a Public Finance Act become more of a government strategy act? And maybe we're partway into that now. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think internationally it's the National Development Plan that is kind of, I think, what you're talking about. There's been a move away from that, partly because it's typically a fixed 5-year plan, and you really need a rolling annual plan and strategy. So you update your strategy every year by adding a year, and then you've got all these problems of integrating it with the actual financial side and financing it, which is the budget.
Yeah, no, thank you. That actually provides a nice segue into the next question. Chris Nees is interested in your views on how well the budget policy statement moves us towards the explicit consideration of environmental policy in the budget process. I think you mentioned it's a good start, but perhaps you want to elaborate on that comment.
Yeah, well, I think the wellbeing framework is a very welcome start in moving beyond economic and fiscal outcomes to adding environmental, social, cultural. It's a very important stake in the ground, but it doesn't take you that far if all the government has to do is say 6 months before the budget at a general level what its priorities are going to be, and then in the fiscal strategy report how it implemented those priorities. I think there's a big step in the middle, as I mentioned before, which is essentially the budget circular and requiring departments and ministries to provide information with their new budget bids on the anticipated environmental impacts of those new budget bids. This would be used to populate a template that the Treasury would operate for its analysts. Obviously, there's capacity issues, etc. That's why I advocate having the Ministry for the Environment engaged in this process, and they will also need capacity development. And you need to build that into the budget framework. Treasury can't do this by itself. It has to. Most of the information is outside the Treasury. There's a risk that if Treasury tries to do too much, it might dilute its core role of managing the public finances and economic policy advice. So I think it's important that this information be captured in the budget process, but that other agencies are involved. And I was attracted to the Parliamentary Commissioner's review of wellbeing budgets in December, where he advocated just this, that more environmental information needs to be presented to decision makers during the budget decision-making process and when the budget's presented to Parliament. To do that, you need to change I would emphasise the budget call circular. The Parliamentary Commissioner mentioned templates for analysis, the cost-benefit analysis tool, fleshing that out in terms of environmental sustainability, the selection of the long-term discount rate, some of these key parameters. I think, and I mentioned before, those other entry points. So you don't just want to focus on the new spending, because there's the whole rump of the baseline. and ministries of finance often find it difficult to get into the baseline. So that's why I'm advocating a periodic green spending review. It's the idea of a spending review is common in other OECD countries. We don't really have a practice here, and I think we could usefully take that up. Not annual, maybe every, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, a big review, and I would advocate an early review of environmental spending to get into the baseline and not just be looking at the marginal new spending.
Yeah, thank you. Phil Evans wants to know, I think this slightly relates to the first question and your response to it about integrating it into the Public Finance Act and broadening it. But Phil Evans wants to know, does any country across the world apply Indigenous views about human relationships with the natural world?
Yeah, that's a great question too. It's not something I profess to know a lot about. At the end of my book, having gone through this Western rationalist approach, which essentially is what I ran through with you today, I say at the end of the day, maybe what is needed is a change of values, how we value the environment. I don't mean putting a monetary value, I mean how we prioritize it. There's a great book by a geographer, Jared Diamond, called Collapse, in which he analyzes throughout history the experiences of societies that have suffered collapse. The Greenland Norse, the Mayans, the famous Easter Islanders, the number of examples of collapse, many of which were associated with environmental degradation. And his conclusion about the societies that successfully avoided collapse, 2 things. One was longer term planning and folding that back into decision making now. And the second was a change of values. And so at that point, I say basically, Indigenous perspectives where we can find some new light on this. I think the New Zealand framework at the moment is pretty anthropogenic, but there's recognition of the importance of Te Ao Māori, and that's starting to be built in. I cite a couple of country examples. I think it's Bolivia, 1 or 2 others in South America, where they've written into the Constitution the importance of Indigenous perspectives on environmental values. Of course, we've done 1 or 2 interesting things here around the Whanganui River, for example. So, I think this is an interesting space. Globally, Indigenous people still kind of manage, I think, a large percentage of the Earth's surface and have almost no rights to manage it. So I think it's a very important issue.
Interesting. The next couple of comments are more about sort of budget realism and the complexities of the budget and the political process that it entails. So perhaps it's trying to provide a bit of challenge to the framework. So Chris notes that the general budget process is a very crowded space with multiple objectives and lots of political compromise, especially under MMP. So would an environmental focused process like this be more likely to deliver the results we want?
Well, yes, the budget process is incredibly contested and complicated, and that's obviously one objection to an attempt, in a sense, to further complicate it. I think it's inevitable, if we're going to try and improve our environmental performance, that we will need to inject more environmental information, as has been the case with the Wellbeing Budgeting Initiative and associated developments, and obviously climate change. And we're going to see from the budget policy statement in this year's budget a real priority around climate change and the emissions trading scheme revenues and hypothecation of those revenues and particular expenditures. You could say that's a complexity, but I think it's unavoidable. And if you do it in a smart way, when you design the budget call circular, you're realistic on what you ask and expect from agencies, and you try and increase the degree of demand over time. The budget call circular has evolved over time, and I think this is a mechanism for doing it. But I think I have to say, I think it would be a mistake to say we shouldn't complicate an already complicated system even further, given what's happening to the state of the environment in New Zealand and globally. I mean, there's probably more I could say there in terms of smart filters, more capacity development at the centre by the ministries of finance, guidance, training to develop the capacity of government for this type of analysis. It's analogous to other developments in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, we managed the public finances on cash. We introduced an accrual system, invested straight away in a fancy IT system to do it, hired a whole lot of accountants from the private sector, developed the capacity. It's ongoing. But thank goodness we did that. And I think hopefully 10 years' time, 20 years' time, we look back and say, thank goodness we really started in this domain.
Yeah, actually, it'd be good if you could tease that out a little bit more, Murray, just particularly on the role of sort of neutral public servants. Michael Thompson provides an observation that it might be only that we've got good climate change architecture after it became a political imperative, or on the flip side, having effective reporting can help build a political case. So how do you see the chicken and egg problem, and how should a neutral public service department navigate this?
Well, I mean, I think public service neutrality is very important. That's one reason I think the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment is such an important instrument in New Zealand. I should mention the Auditor General as well, who I think has an important potential role, for example, in performance auditing, the effectiveness of environmental policies. I could have referred to the National Audit Office in the UK, which has been doing some very good value for money audits. And in New Zealand, we really lack, I'm going on a slightly tangent here, we really lack monitoring and evaluation capacity in government. MFE doesn't really have that capacity. It has a mandate under the Act, 1987 Environment Act, but it doesn't have capacity. The Parliamentary Commissioner should be reviewing, not being the first producer of monitoring and evaluation research. So I think there's a real problem there, which I could talk about it in more length. Sorry, just remind me of the question, James.
Oh, it's
public service. How did these issues get raised? Well,
yeah, it's more that sort of chicken and egg type sort of what sort of comes first.
Yes. Right. The Paris Agreement kick-started the focus on greenhouse gas emissions coming from a global pure public good. So essentially, that was the mechanism. But we have these initiatives in New Zealand now. I was asked 3 or 4 years ago, do you think any government's going to commit itself to targets in the environmental space? We're getting closer to that. We have an exposure draft of a bill in Parliament of a Natural and Built Environment Act. It may not get passed in that form, it may get watered down, it may not get implemented well. But we're closer to it than we were 3 years ago with that bill. We've got a consultation draft from the Ministry for the Environment, which would mandate the government response to each State of the Environment synthesis report. Hopefully that can be translated in a bit more depth into saying what its targets and goals are. So part of the political impetus, I guess, comes from mounting concern. Public officials have a role in bringing that information to bear to decision makers, pointing out the implications of alternative policies, of choices, of strategies. Of course, elected officials make the decisions, but the framework here is to ensure that there is transparency to Parliament. The Auditor General can audit. Parliamentary Commissioner sitting there. We have public and the media. So that whole framework, if there's better information presented, hopefully it will change incentives over time. I should say the long-term insights briefing, I guess, is another attempt, but that to me could just end up being a parallel long-term report. We really need to fold those long-term things back into actions today and in the medium term.
Yeah, that integration point you make. This is an interesting question here from Matthew Shako. Why does the government seem to be very responsive to climate change and not so responsive to biodiversity loss?
Well, I think partly it's the international agreement and our commitment to that. It would have been a rather lonely company with, I think it's North Korea, and I don't know, that might have been about it. So there's a huge amount of international pressure on every country in this space as the scientific evidence mounts. Thank goodness, in the 1990s, the scientists got onto this and started producing this forward-looking scenarios, linking it to greenhouse gas emissions and international cooperation and some kind of credibility around that framework. So I think that had a lot to do with it. It's taken a while for it to mature. I think the UK Climate Change Act in 2008 was critical, a really important institutional innovation. We've very recently introduced that here, but that framework of 5-year carbon budgets and linking it to what government is doing now, that's the connection. Frankly, the UK hasn't got that connection to its budget yet, and we might. That's the opportunity to really connect the carbon budgets, policies required to fiscal strategy, ETS pricing, and annual budget policies. I think that's what I have to say in response to that.
So does biodiversity miss out because it's a bit more disparate, and the science and data is not perhaps as advanced to create the political imperative that climate change is?
Well, interestingly, the International Convention on Biodiversity is almost not worth the paper it's written on. It's just so weak. Countries argue and agonize over the language, and then no one takes any notice. The latest draft has got stuff from 10 years ago or whatever that no one has looked at in between hardly. I mean, it's a framework convention that is seriously lacking teeth, and so that international mechanism isn't there. And I mean, obviously, climate change is a global public good, so that explains, in a sense, it explains that. But with improved national state of environment reporting, improved information on biodiversity, threatened species, quality of water, quality of air, etc., plus forward-looking risk analysis around where we're heading under current policies, and then linking that to current policies and government accountability. That I guess is the way to try and close the loop. As I said, the UK's just done it in its Environment Act. Sweden's had it for quite a long time, so maybe that's something to do with the electorate, maybe with their political situation. The Norwegians as well have been better at incorporating. But yeah, I think that's certainly correct observation. We're further ahead on climate change than the other domains, and that's why I advocate looking at everything and not just climate change.
Yeah. I've probably got time for a couple more questions. So these ones focus on carbon budgets and credits. Chris acknowledges that while it's only one part of the challenge to address environmental sustainability, what do you think about the development of carbon budgets that New Zealand is rolling out?
Well, look, as I say, I live here and work overseas, so I just do not pretend to have read the Climate Change Commission's report. I'd love to have had the time, but I'm a big fan of the mechanism of 5-yearly carbon budgets, mandated government response to basically say what policies are they going to put in place. The budgets are linked obviously to our commitments, and it sort of helps cement the commitment and connect it to current action. And I think I did a little bit of work in the UK last year, and seeing the depth of climate change analysis in the UK government after 3 5-year cycles of carbon budgets. It's just a pity we don't have time globally for this kind of normal sort of institutional deepening and strengthening. The climate crisis doesn't allow us that, but we're very new to the game. Government missed its first mandated timing of response. I believe the UK government has missed a mandated response. There are reasons for it, obviously. but it'll be very interesting to look at the May budget and see how far it takes us.
Okay. And lastly, Cameron McCulloch, he's a bit sceptical of the use of carbon credit systems and asks, do carbon credit systems and similar systems create warped views of some industries, for instance, such as farming, which captures CO2 and is not included in the calculation? And yeah, when our ultimate goal should be on focusing on long-term capturing of carbon and prevention. So I think there's probably a few things in there, but sort of, yeah, generally, how do you think the carbon credit systems sort of stacks up?
Again, I'm no expert on this. I recognise the risks and the challenges, and this is one of the technical challenges I mentioned that I don't want to just gloss over. But measuring carbon impacts, measuring offsets, are they real offsets? These are formidable challenges that have to be grappled with. Carbon capture and storage may end up saving us, but I don't believe we should be placing a bet on that. It's not the sort of bet we would place in any other domain. Taking that kind of risk that we don't have to act now, carbon capture and storage will end up saving us. It may end up stopping us get to 4 degrees warming or 3 degrees warming, but we've got an awful lot to do before we should rely on that. But thankfully, the big G7 economies are investing hugely in that, and everybody will reap the reward if they manage to improve the cost effectiveness of those technologies. But more generally, carbon credit systems, we've seen fake carbon credits, we've seen corruption in the carbon credit market internationally. These are real challenges and require a lot of thought and work and careful auditing, etc., to the best degree possible.
Yeah, interesting. Hey, look, well, I think we might wrap it up there. I think three things that have stood out to me, Murray, was the mainstreaming of environmental reporting. The idea that this shouldn't be a fancy little add-on that supplements the main fiscal and budgeting strategy. The need to be more forward-looking. The pace of change in this area is happening so fast. A current state of the environment report can be out of date and gathering dust, as you say, soon after. And the other thing that pointed out to me was moving on from the general to the specific. Big or vague promises need to be backed by specifics if they are to result in meaningful change. And so getting those interim targets in place, getting better measurement, independent reporting and monitoring, that's the long-term game. Look, Murray, that was a really interesting session and some great food for thought as we consider our roles and how we can make a difference to environmental outcomes. So on behalf of Te Tai Ohanga and everyone here, thanks very much for coming and providing us with your wisdom and challenge today. It's been a real privilege to have you here with us. I'd like to close today with a whakatauki that reminds us to keep learning from each other. Whawhea te kete mātauranga, fill the basket of knowledge. Look, there'll be more opportunities through 2022 to hear from more speakers about a range of topics in both the Treasury Guest Lecture Series and the Wellbeing Report Virtual Seminar Series. So look out for those. And so hope to see you all there. And until next time, mā te wā.
Well, thank you, James. Thank you very much for the opportunity and good luck to the Treasury. This is extremely demanding work and I recognise that. Good luck with the efforts.
Thanks so much, Murray.